The wind crawled low across the canyon, whistling through the bones of dry trees and stirring the dust that had settled over the valley like forgotten prayer ash. The village below, a scatter of wooden cabins and tents clinging to the red earth, seemed half asleep under the setting sun. Horses snorted near the watering trough, their shadows stretching long across the dirt. Somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck iron, slow and steady, keeping rhythm with the heartbeat of a land too wild to be tamed. And yet, within that wilderness, one woman dared to do the unthinkable. She turned her back on an Apache chief. She hadn't meant for it to come to that. For days she had followed the trail that wound through the cliffs, leading deeper into Apache territory, carrying supplies for the trading post. The settlers called her reckless. Some whispered she was foolish, but she had learned to ignore the chatter of fearful men. They didn't understand the silence of the desert, or the way it spoke when no one else did. She had traded with the Apache before, blankets for grain, knives for corn, and though the risk was always there, she had never been harmed. Until that evening, the day had begun like any other, heat rising from the earth, a sky wide as forever. She rode her mule with a calm heart and a firm hand, her bonnet tied tight, her eyes sharp beneath the brim. The hills were quiet except for the cry of a hawk circling overhead. But by sundown, the quiet had changed. It was no longer peace. It was a waiting. The air grew thick, the wind too still, and her instincts whispered that she was being watched. When they appeared, it was like the land itself moved. Shadows emerged from behind the rocks, silent riders with dark braids, their faces painted with streaks of ochre and ash. The leader dismounted first, tall and solemn, his expression unreadable. His horse stamped the ground, kicking up small clouds of dust. She knew at once he wasn't an ordinary warrior. The way the others looked to him, the way the silence bent around his presence, he was a chief. He spoke few words at first. His voice was low, calm, and sure, carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. He asked her why she had come alone, why she carried the flag of the settlers when she walked among the people his tribe had learned to distrust. She tried to explain. She was no soldier, only a trader, but her words were like water on stone. His gaze never softened, and though his tone stayed even, there was something in it that made her heart pound. He took her reins and told her to follow, and she did, through narrow passes and dry riverbeds until they reached his camp, a small circle of lodges hidden beneath the cliffs. The Apache there watched her with suspicion, their eyes sharp but not cruel. Children peeked from behind the hides, women stirred pots over low fires, and the chief said something in his language that made them turn away. He led her to the edge of his tent and told her to wait. Night fell quickly. The stars came out bright and close, pressing against the black sky like embers. The firelight flickered across his face as he returned, his expression unreadable but not harsh. He offered her water, a sign of trust, and she took it with trembling hands. For a long while, neither spoke. It was a strange peace. Two people from different worlds sitting across the same flame, bound by circumstance and curiosity, but peace never lasts long in a land where every shadow hides a story. When she finally dared to rise and turn away, to show her back and walk toward her mule, his voice cut through the night like the crack of a whip. "Do it again," he warned, slow and steady, his tone carrying both danger and something deeper. "And I'll never let you go." She froze. The words weren't shouted, but they hit harder than a bullet. He wasn't threatening her life. Something else trembled beneath those words, something that made her breath catch. She turned back, meeting his gaze in the firelight. There was no cruelty there, only the wild tension of two worlds colliding, neither willing to yield. In that moment, the desert itself seemed to hold its breath. The wind rose from the canyon again, carrying the faint smell of smoke and rain. A coyote cried in the distance, its howl echoing through the valley like a warning. She could feel the pulse of the earth beneath her boots, the same rhythm that matched the thump in her chest. He stepped closer, the light painting his face in gold and shadow. His eyes, dark and steady, searched hers as though he was looking for an answer she didn't have. He told her that the white men had burned his brother's camp, that he trusted no one who came from the villages, and yet here she was, unarmed, standing before him with defiance in her eyes. "I came with peace," she said quietly, "but I'll not be told when to turn or where to stand." Something in her voice made him pause. It wasn't arrogance, it was strength, the kind that came from surviving too many nights alone. His hand twitched at his side, not to threaten, but as if to steady himself. The fire popped, sending sparks into the dark, and for a heartbeat the two of them seemed locked in a space that belonged to neither tribe nor settler. The others in the camp began to whisper. A few laughed under their breath, but the chief silenced them with a glance. The woman stood still, her chin high, her shadow trembling in the light. He said nothing more, only turned and motioned for her to follow again, but she didn't move. The canyon wind shifted, carrying the sound of distant horses, perhaps settlers searching, perhaps raiders circling. No one knew for sure. She realized then that she was caught between two worlds, one that would never accept her courage, and one that might never forgive it. The Apache chief watched her like a man studying a storm, unsure whether it would bring rain or ruin. He asked her name. She hesitated, then gave it. He repeated it once, testing the sound on his tongue, as though he was deciding whether it was worth remembering. And when he said it, she felt the ground tilt beneath her, because somehow it didn't sound like hers anymore. It sounded like his. Then came the faint rustle from the edge of the camp. A scout rode in fast, breathless muttering in Apache. The chief's expression changed, his jaw tightening. He turned to her, eyes sharp now, his earlier calm replaced by urgency. He told her to stay put, but she stepped closer, asking what was happening. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and caught her arm, not roughly but firmly enough that she could feel the strength beneath his grip. "Stay," he said. "If you turn from me again—" He stopped mid-sentence, his voice lowering into a whisper that brushed against her ear like a promise. "If you turn from me again, I'll never let you go." And before she could answer, he was gone, disappearing into the darkness with his riders, the sound of hooves fading into the wind. She stood alone by the fire, her hand still tingling where he'd touched her, the words echoing in her mind. The flames crackled, throwing restless shadows across the tents. Above her, the sky stretched wide and merciless, the same sky that had watched 1,000 such stories unfold in silence. Somewhere out in the night, the Apache chief rode toward danger, and she, the woman who had dared to turn her back, realized she might have started something neither of them could stop. The wind howled again through the canyon, and the desert listened. The story was only beginning. The night after the chief rode away was long and restless. The wind wouldn't stop whispering through the cliffs, carrying faint sounds that made her rise from her place by the dying fire. Every snap of a twig felt like a step, every sigh of the wind like a voice trying to warn her. The Apache camp had grown silent. No more laughter, no more low talk near the fires. Even the horses stood still, their ears twitching at the faint rumble far beyond the ridge. She sat by the embers, clutching her coat tighter around her shoulders, wondering what kind of battle was unfolding out there in the darkness. She had heard stories of raids and ambushes. Settlers blamed the Apache for every lost wagon or missing herd, while the Apache blamed the settlers for every burned camp and stolen child. She didn't know which stories were true anymore. What she did know was that the chief, whatever his name was, had looked at her not with hatred but with something heavy and unreadable. Something that told her she might never truly leave this place unchanged. When dawn finally came, it came without peace. The sun rose over the cliffs like a slow bleeding wound, spilling red light across the valley. The camp stirred, women tending fires, children feeding the horses, men sharpening their knives. She asked one of the women, using the few Apache words she knew, where the chief had gone. The woman only looked at her with pity and pointed toward the mountains. She waited. All morning she waited. The wind carried no sound of hooves returning. She tried to focus on her mule, brushing its mane, checking her saddle, anything to distract her from the unease curling in her stomach. But by midday, when the chief still hadn't returned, she began to fear that he might not come back at all. As the hours passed, she wandered beyond the camp's edge, drawn by the murmur of the river that cut through the valley. She knelt by the water, washing the dust from her hands, watching the reflection of the sky ripple and break. This land, harsh and untamed, held both beauty and cruelty in equal measure. It could give life, and it could take it just as easily. She remembered the first time she'd come west, 5 years ago, when her husband was still alive. He had dreamed of land, of freedom, of building something with his own hands. But dreams didn't last long in the frontier. A fever took him that first winter, leaving her with nothing but a small cabin, a half-dug well, and a heart that refused to break. She learned to trade, to shoot, to ride through storms without flinching. The settlers stopped calling her foolish after that. They started calling her the woman who doesn't scare easy. But courage didn't mean peace. Every night she'd felt the weight of solitude pressing against her chest, a silence too wide for one heart to fill. Maybe that was why she'd come this far into Apache land, to chase a bargain, or perhaps to find something she couldn't name. By late afternoon, she saw movement on the ridge. The chief had returned. Dust rose around the horses as they rode in, weary and marked by battle. One of the men was wounded, his arm hanging limp, his face pale. The others led him toward the fires while the chief dismounted, his eyes scanning the camp before settling on her. His expression was still unreadable, but there was something darker there now, something that had changed since the night before. He walked past her without a word, toward his tent. For a moment she thought of leaving then and there, saddling her mule and heading back toward the trading post before the desert swallowed the light. But something stronger than reason made her follow him. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and earth. The chief sat cross-legged near the fire pit, his bow resting beside him. A strip of cloth was tied around his arm, darkened with blood. He didn't look up when she entered. "You should have gone," he said quietly. "And leave without knowing what happened?" She asked, his jaw tightened. "White soldiers. They moved closer to the mountains. They say this land belongs to them now." She hesitated, unsure what to say. "I thought the treaty." He looked up then, his gaze sharp enough to silence her. "Treaties are made by men who never see this land. They draw lines on paper, but they do not bleed when the lines are crossed." The fire cracked between them. He studied her face for a long moment, then said, "You should go back to your people. They will not forgive you for walking among mine." "Maybe I don't have any people left," she said softly. He frowned as if trying to understand. She told him about the fever, about the cabin and the well, about how the townsfolk only came around when they needed her supplies, but never invited her to their gatherings. She spoke without tears, because the land had already taken them long ago. When she finished, he didn't speak right away. Finally, he said, "The desert keeps what it wants. Maybe it has kept you here for a reason." Outside, thunder rolled over the cliffs. The sky had turned strange and green, the kind of color that made men uneasy. A storm was coming. The Apache began to tie down their tents, calling to the children to stay close. She moved to help, her hands steady as she secured the hides against the poles. The wind picked up fast, whipping her hair loose, stinging her face with grit. And still she worked beside them, refusing to hide. When the storm hit, it came like a beast unleashed. Rain poured in sheets, lightning split the sky, and the ground turned to mud beneath their feet. The chief's voice rose above the chaos, shouting orders, steady and calm even as the wind tore at the camp. She saw him help the wounded man to shelter, then turn toward her again. She was struggling to hold the line of one tent, the ropes slipping through her wet hands. He ran to her side, their shoulders braced against the storm, his arms steadying hers as they pulled together. When it was finally over, when the thunder rolled away into the mountains, they stood side by side in the gray light, drenched and breathless. The camp had survived. The fires were out, but the people were safe. He looked at her then, not as a stranger, but as someone who had stood through the storm beside him. She turned away, but his voice stopped her. "You turned your back on me once," he said, quiet but firm. "Do not do it again." She met his gaze, her heart pounding. "And if I do?" His eyes held hers for a long, unbearable moment. "Then the wind will carry your name," he said, "and I will follow it until I find you." She didn't answer. The rain still dripped from her hair, running down her neck, but she couldn't feel the cold anymore. Something in his words, half warning, half vow, had settled deep inside her. Later, as the camp settled for the night, she sat alone near the dying embers of the fire. The chief's tent was dark, but she could see his shadow move across the hide. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, an owl called, its cry lonely and endless. She thought about the life she'd left behind, the empty cabin, the unmarked grave, the stillness of mornings with no one to speak to. Out here, even the danger felt more alive than that kind of silence. But what frightened her most wasn't the tribe or the wildland. It was the feeling that she was already being pulled into something she didn't understand, something that had nothing to do with trade or survival. The way he had looked at her, like she was a secret he'd been waiting to uncover, made her wonder if she was meant to stay after all. When she finally closed her eyes, the wind shifted again, carrying the faint sound of drums from far beyond the canyon. She didn't know whether it was a song of mourning or of warning. Either way, it was too late to turn back now. The desert had heard her name, and so had the Apache chief. The next morning came slow and uneasy. The rain had passed, leaving the ground soft and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and smoke. The sun crept up behind the ridges, lighting the canyon in pale gold, but no one in the Apache camp looked toward it. There was tension in the air, a quiet that spoke of waiting and worry. The chief stood at the edge of the camp, speaking with two of his warriors in low tones. Their faces were grave, their eyes fixed on the distant horizon where thin lines of smoke rose like ghosts from the valley floor. She watched them from a distance, pretending to busy herself with her mule, but her heart beat fast. She had learned enough of their language to catch a few words. Soldiers, river, burned trail. Whatever had happened in the night was not over. The chief's voice carried calm authority, but the men around him moved with restless energy, ready to ride at a moment's call. She wanted to ask what was happening, to offer help or at least understand. But every time she stepped closer, something in his expression held her back. He had warned her before, and she knew better than to test his patience again. Still, her curiosity grew stronger than her fear. She followed one of the younger warriors, a boy really, no older than 16, who led the horses to water. He looked at her with suspicion when she approached, but didn't stop her. She asked him quietly what had happened beyond the ridge. He hesitated, glancing toward the chief, then said only, "Bluecoats burned the lower camp." The words struck like a hammer. Bluecoats, soldiers. She knew what that meant. The army had pushed deeper into Apache lands again. That was why the chief had ridden out. That was why he had come back changed. She looked toward the ridge where the smoke still rose, wondering how close the fighting was, wondering what the settlers back in town were being told. They'd call it a victory, she thought. They'd say it was justice, but they wouldn't see the homes burned or the children hiding in the canyons. By midday, the camp was in motion. The women packed supplies, the men readied weapons, and horses were loaded for travel. She went to the chief's tent, her resolve trembling but firm. "You're leaving," she said when he turned to face her. "Yes," he replied simply. "And what about me?" "You ride south. The river will lead you to your people." She shook her head. "That river leads to the fort. If the soldiers are moving through this land, I'll be caught between both sides." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You do not belong in either." It wasn't meant as an insult, but it stung like one. "Then tell me where I do belong," she said. He studied her for a long moment. "The desert will decide," he said finally, before stepping past her to mount his horse. She watched as he gave orders to his riders, his voice calm even as the tension grew. He looked every bit the leader now, sharp, unyielding, carved by the land itself. The people trusted him. She could see it in the way they followed without question, and yet, beneath that strength she saw something else, an exhaustion that no one else noticed. A man fighting battles not just against enemies, but against the weight of his own choices. When the riders left, the camp grew emptier, quieter. Only a few women, children, and elders remained. She stayed, though every instinct told her to leave. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was fate, but she couldn't walk away from what she didn't yet understand. She helped where she could, gathering water, tending fires, mending torn hides. The others began to tolerate her, though some still kept their distance. She didn't mind. It was better than the silence of her cabin. That night, one of the older women sat beside her near the fire. Her hair was silver, her eyes sharp as flint. Through broken words and gestures, she told her that the chief's father had been killed years ago when soldiers broke a peace agreement. The young chief had taken his place, sworn to protect his people and never bow to another man's promise. Since then, every decision he made carried the weight of blood. As she listened, she understood more of the man she had defied. His warning, "Do it again and I'll never let you go," was not born from pride alone, but from a life where turning one's back could mean death. He had seen betrayal too many times to bear it again, and somehow, without knowing how or why, she had become a part of that struggle. Days passed. The chief returned once briefly to bring supplies and check on the wounded. His arm was wrapped in fresh cloth, but his face showed no pain. When he saw her by the fire, something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe even relief, but he said nothing. They spoke only when necessary, yet every glance carried words unspoken. One evening, a small group of settlers appeared near the edge of the valley. 2 men and a woman, traveling with a wagon. They claimed to be lost, looking for safe passage back to the fort. The Apache allowed them to camp under watch, though distrust was thick in the air. She recognized one of them, a trader from the outpost, a man known for selling rifles to both sides. He greeted her with false warmth, calling her by name as though they were old friends. "You're alive," he said, feigning surprise. "We thought you'd been taken." She looked at him coldly. "Maybe I have," he chuckled, lowering his voice. "These people won't protect you. When the army comes, they'll wipe this place clean." "Best you come with us." Before she could answer, the chief appeared behind her. His presence was silent but commanding. The trader's smile faltered. The chief spoke in English this time, his tone even. "You will leave when the sun rises." The trader nodded quickly, backing away. But that night, as the camp slept, she saw movement by the wagons. The trader and his men were whispering, loading their rifles quietly. Her stomach tightened. She ran to the chief's tent, shaking him awake. "They're going to attack," she said urgently. He rose without hesitation, bow in hand, his eyes already sharp. Within moments, the camp was alive with motion. The traders fired first, a single shot that cracked the silence. Horses reared, children cried, and chaos swept through the valley. The chief moved like lightning, his arrows finding their mark even in the dark. She grabbed a rifle from the wagon and fired once, her hands trembling but steady. The fight was brief, brutal, and silent when it ended. The traders lay still near the fire, the woman among them crying softly over one of the bodies. The chief stood over them, his chest rising and falling, his expression unreadable. He looked toward her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that wasn't anger or command. It was fear, not for himself but for what would come next. "They will come for revenge," he said quietly. "The soldiers will not rest now." She nodded, her throat dry. "Then what do we do?" He didn't answer right away. He turned toward the horizon, where lightning flickered faintly in the distance. "We move before dawn," he said. "You too." She wanted to protest, but the look on his face stopped her. It wasn't a request, it was a plea wrapped in authority. She realized then that he wasn't just trying to save his people. He was trying to save her from becoming one of them in the army's eyes. As the night wore on, she sat alone by the dying fire, watching the sparks fade into the wind. She could still hear the echo of gunfire in her ears, could still feel the weight of his hand when he'd pulled her out of harm's way. The line between enemy and ally had blurred beyond recognition. The chief stood watch at the edge of camp, his silhouette outlined against the faint light of dawn. He didn't look back, but she knew he was aware of her gaze. The distance between them was more than space. It was a boundary neither could cross without losing everything. And yet, when the first light touched the valley and the camp began to move again, she felt a strange certainty deep inside her. She wasn't leaving, not yet. Whatever battle waited ahead, she was already part of it. Whether she was ready or not, the desert had chosen its side. The trail south was no longer safe. Every ridge, every hollow, every flicker of dust on the horizon could be an army patrol. The Apache chief knew it, and so did she. For days they moved quietly through the canyons, the sound of hooves swallowed by sand. The few families that had survived the last raid traveled with them. Women clutching infants, boys leading weary horses, old men who refused to leave their dead behind. The desert was wide, yet it felt smaller with danger closing in from all sides. She rode beside the chief without speaking, her mule keeping pace with his horse. The air between them was heavy, not with anger but with everything left unsaid. Sometimes she caught him watching her from the corner of his eye, and she wondered what he saw. A burden, an ally, or something far more complicated. By the third night, they reached a dry ravine sheltered by rocks. Fires were forbidden. Too much smoke could give them away. The stars overhead burned bright, indifferent to the suffering below. The chief gathered his scouts and studied the land ahead, tracing routes in the dust with a stick. She listened from the shadows, trying to read his expression. When one of the scouts mentioned seeing blue uniforms near the river, his jaw clenched, though his voice stayed calm. After the meeting, she approached him quietly. "You can't outrun them forever," she said. He looked at her then, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "I do not run," he replied. "I move where they do not see. And if they find you, then they find me standing." His words carried no arrogance, only truth. He was a man shaped by loss, by a fight that had begun long before she ever crossed his path. She wanted to tell him that not all settlers wanted war, that not everyone saw his people as enemies. But she stopped herself. Words like that meant little here. The wind was the only witness, and even it spoke in whispers. Later that night, she couldn't sleep. The cold bit through her blanket, and the silence pressed down hard. Somewhere beyond the rocks, a coyote cried. She thought about her cabin again, about the well and the quiet that used to comfort her. But now that same quiet felt hollow. Out here, even fear had a pulse. It made her feel alive. Before dawn, she saw movement, 2 riders slipping out of camp heading north. Scouts, she thought, but something in the way they moved made her uneasy. They didn't take the usual path. She followed them on foot, staying low behind the rocks. When she reached the ridge, she saw what she feared, a flash of metal in the moonlight, the glint of rifles. They weren't scouts, they were spies. One of them was the wounded man from the lower camp, his loyalty already in question. He was speaking to a soldier kneeling beside his horse, pointing back toward the ravine. Her stomach turned cold. She ran back to camp as fast as she could, her breath sharp in the cold air. When she found the chief, he was already awake, sharpening his knife. She told him what she saw. His face hardened instantly. "Show me," he said. By the time they returned to the ridge, the spies were gone. Only hoofprints remained in the sand. He knelt, touching the tracks, his fingers brushing over them as if reading a message. Then he rose and gave orders to his men. Move the women, hide the supplies, prepare for an attack. His calmness frightened her more than panic ever could. The sun climbed slowly, bringing light but no warmth. Every sound, the creak of leather, the stamp of a horse, seemed louder. Children were hidden in caves, their mothers whispering prayers. The chief's warriors formed a circle around the ravine, silent and ready. She stayed near the center, clutching the old rifle she'd taken from the trader's wagon. Her hands trembled, but she didn't lower it. By midday, the soldiers appeared on the horizon. Dust clouds first, then the glint of metal and the rhythmic clatter of hooves. There were more of them than she had feared, at least 30 riders moving in formation. The Apache chief stood tall at the front, his horse still as stone. He raised one hand and the camp fell silent. The soldiers halted at a distance. Their leader, a man in a gray coat and wide-brimmed hat, rode forward. His face was hard, his voice louder than it needed to be. "You're on U.S. land," he called out. "Lay down your weapons and come peacefully." The chief didn't move. "This land was ours before your forts and fences," he said. "We do not lay down to thieves." The soldier's hand moved to his holster. "You're harboring a white woman. Return her and I'll spare your people." Every eye in the camp turned to her. The words sliced through the air like a blade. She wanted to shout that she wasn't being held, that she had stayed by choice, but her voice refused to come. The chief looked at her only once, then back at the soldiers. "She rides with me," he said simply. The officer's expression twisted. "Then she dies with you." The tension broke like thunder. A shot rang out. No one knew from which side, and the canyon erupted in chaos. Horses screamed, men shouted, and dust filled the air. She dropped behind a rock, the rifle heavy in her shaking hands. The chief's warriors moved fast, striking from both flanks. Bullets cracked overhead, chipping stone. The smell of gunpowder burned her throat. She saw the chief dismount, moving through the storm of bullets as if the land itself protected him. He shouted orders in his language, his voice steady despite the chaos. A soldier lunged toward him and the chief met him with a single fierce strike. The man fell. She fired once, missing. The second time, her bullet found its mark. She had never killed before, and the sound of it would never leave her ears. The soldiers began to retreat up the ridge, dragging their wounded. The Apache held their ground, but at a cost. 3 of their own lay still near the fire pits. The air was thick with smoke and grief. When the shooting stopped, silence returned like a ghost. She stood there, trembling, her heart beating so hard she thought it might break. The chief walked toward her, his face streaked with dust and blood, his expression unreadable. He looked at her rifle, then at her hands. "You fought," he said quietly. "I didn't have a choice. There is always a choice." She wanted to argue, to tell him that survival isn't a choice, it's a reflex. But before she could speak, one of his men shouted from the ridge. More riders were coming. This time not soldiers, but settlers. Armed men from the towns, chasing the same blood they'd spilled for generations. The chief turned to his people. "We move now," he ordered. The camp erupted into motion once more. Horses were saddled, supplies gathered. The wounded lifted onto stretchers. The sky darkened with dust and smoke, the sun vanishing behind the hills. She followed the chief up the narrow trail that led deeper into the mountains, her legs burning, her lungs raw from the climb. Halfway up, she stumbled. He caught her arm, steadying her without a word. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, hers filled with fear, his with something that almost looked like regret. "You should have left when you could," he said. "Maybe I was never meant to," she replied. He said nothing, but his grip tightened briefly before letting go. Ahead, the trail narrowed between jagged cliffs. The sound of pursuit echoed faintly behind them. The settlers were close. As they reached the ridge's crest, thunder rolled again, not from the sky but from the valley below. The soldiers had returned with artillery. The first cannon blast tore through the air, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Horses panicked. Children screamed. The chief turned, scanning the cliffs, searching for cover. He pointed toward a hidden canyon beyond the ridge, a place known only to his tribe. "There," he said. "We make our stand there." And she followed, knowing that whatever waited in that canyon, victory or ruin, would decide everything. The storm that had been building since the day she first turned her back on him was finally breaking. The desert had chosen its moment. The wind howled across the cliffs like a warning, and she could feel it deep in her bones. The story was racing toward its fire. The canyon swallowed them whole, the air thick with dust and fear. The thunder of guns still echoed behind them as the Apache chief led his people through the narrow pass, his voice steady, urging them forward. She followed close, her heart pounding, her hands gripping the reins so tight they burned. The cliffs rose high on both sides, jagged and red, their shadows swallowing the last light of day. It felt like the end of the world, the kind of silence before everything changes forever. When they reached the hidden canyon, it was as if the desert itself had granted them one last refuge. There was water trickling through the rocks, and a small grove of twisted trees offering shelter. The chief ordered the people to rest and tend to the wounded. Fires were lit carefully, hidden under the stones to keep from drawing eyes from above. Children cried softly, mothers held them close. The air was heavy with smoke, grief, and something unspoken, hope, fragile, but still alive. She found herself sitting near the stream, washing the dirt and blood from her hands. Her reflection rippled in the water, ghost-like and tired. Behind her, footsteps crunched over the gravel. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. The chief stood beside her, silent, his shadow stretching long in the firelight. For the first time since the battle, his armor of calm seemed cracked. "They will come again," she said quietly. "Yes," he answered. "But not tonight." He knelt beside the stream, scooping a handful of water to his lips. She could see the exhaustion in his movements, the weight he carried for everyone who followed him. "You fought for us," he said. "You did not have to." She looked at him. "You fought for me first." He didn't reply, but the corner of his mouth twitched, almost like a smile. The sound of the water filled the silence between them, soft and constant. In that stillness, something shifted. Not a word, not a promise, just understanding. As the night deepened, the tribe slept. The wind blew through the canyon, carrying the faint smell of rain. She sat awake, listening, her mind drifting through memories. She thought of the cabin she had left behind, the grave she had marked, the life she thought she'd live. That woman seemed far away now, like someone from another lifetime. Out here, the land had stripped her down to what she truly was, someone who had learned to stand, to endure, to see beyond the lines men had drawn in the sand. Near dawn, a scout returned with news. The soldiers had turned back toward the fort, leaving the valley behind. Perhaps they thought the tribe had fled farther south, or perhaps they'd lost more men than they could afford. Either way, the danger had passed. For now, the chief gave quiet orders to begin moving at first light, deeper into the mountains where the army would not follow. When the camp stirred, she helped where she could, binding wounds, passing water, calming frightened horses. The people no longer looked at her as an outsider. A few even spoke to her, soft and respectful. She felt it then, a strange ache in her chest, realizing she had found a kind of belonging she never expected. The chief approached her before they left. "When we reach the high valley, the people will stay," he said. "You should go east to the trading road. You can return to your world." She met his eyes. "And if I don't want to?" He hesitated. "The desert keeps what it claims," he said, repeating his old words. "But it also takes what it loves. You do not belong to this land, and it will not spare you." She smiled faintly. "Neither has the world I came from." He looked at her for a long time, as if trying to find something he couldn't name. "If you stay," he said slowly, "you walk the same road I do, there will be no peace, only survival." "Then maybe survival is enough," she whispered. The morning sun broke through the clouds then, painting the cliffs in gold. The people began to move again, the line of riders winding through the canyon like a silent river. She rode behind the chief, her heart torn between two worlds, the one she had lost and the one she was still trying to understand. The trail was long and unforgiving, but for the first time, she didn't fear it. As they reached higher ground, the view opened wide below them. Miles of desert stretched to the horizon, glowing red and endless under the rising sun. Smoke from the burned valley was barely visible now, fading into the morning sky. The chief stopped his horse and turned to look back one last time. She did the same. It wasn't defeat they saw behind them, but the cost of endurance. By midday, they reached the high valley. There, the tribe built their new camp, smaller, quieter, hidden among the rocks. The air was cooler, the soil soft from underground springs. It wasn't much, but it was life. The people worked without complaint, rebuilding from ashes as they had done countless times before. She helped them carry stones, gather wood, mend torn hides. Every task reminded her how fragile and fierce survival could be. That night, after the fires burned low, the chief came to her again. He carried no weapons, only a single blanket draped over his shoulders. They walked together to the edge of the ridge where the moonlight spilled across the desert. For a long while, neither spoke. The night was clear, the stars bright enough to see every scar in the land. "When I was a boy," he said finally, "my father told me that the desert has no mercy, only memory. It remembers every step we take, every promise we break." She listened, her gaze on the horizon. "Then let it remember this night," she said softly. "Let it remember that you still stood." He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the firelight from the camp below. "And what will it remember of you?" "That I didn't turn away," she answered. He studied her face as if committing it to memory. The wind moved through the canyon again, lifting strands of her hair, brushing dust across their boots. He reached out slowly, his hand resting over hers, not claiming, not demanding, just grounding her in that moment. "You saved my life when you warned me," he said quietly. "I said you would pay for it. Perhaps I was wrong. Or maybe you were right," she said. "Just not in the way you thought." They stood together in silence, the kind that doesn't need words. The desert stretched endless and wild before them, a place that broke men and shaped legends. The night air carried the faint sound of drums from the camp, soft, steady, alive. By morning she knew she couldn't stay. The tribe had found their refuge, and though her heart had tied itself to the land, her place was still somewhere beyond the ridge. She packed what little she had, her blanket, her rifle, a pouch of dried corn the women had given her. The chief waited near the edge of camp, his horse saddled, his expression unreadable. "You will find the road by noon," he said. "It leads east." She nodded, tightening the reins. "And you?" "I lead my people north where the rivers are clear," he said, "if the desert allows it." For a moment, neither moved. Then he stepped forward and pressed something into her hand, a small piece of carved stone, smooth and warm from his palm. "For when you forget who you are," he said. She looked down at it, then back at him. "I won't forget," she whispered. The sun rose behind them as she turned her mule toward the open plain. She didn't look back right away, afraid of what it might feel like to see him fading into the distance. But when she finally did, he was still there, a dark figure against the morning light, watching until she disappeared over the ridge. The land stretched before her, vast and silent, but it no longer felt empty. The wind carried his words with it, the ones that had haunted her since the first night. "Do it again and I'll never let you go." Now she understood. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, the kind that lives beyond time, beyond war, beyond what men call love. And somewhere deep in the desert, where the sun met the dust and the horizon blurred, she felt the truth of it. The story wasn't about escape or surrender. It was about belonging to something larger than fear, larger than loss. The desert didn't give mercy, but it gave meaning. And that was enough.